Okay.
Okay, yeah, so we're here for the Oral History Project with the Ohio Psychological Association, and I have Dr. Sandy Shullman with me today to be interviewed. I'm going to introduce Sandy and then have some time to ask questions. So, Dr. Sandra Shullman is managing partner of the Columbus office of the Executive Development Group, an international leadership development and consulting firm, and she's written and presented extensively on the topics of performance appraisal, performance management, strategic succession planning, career development, management of self-esteem and motivation, team building, diversity management, and sexual harassment. Dr. Shullman has served on the APA Board of Directors and is now the president of the American Psychological Association for this year, 2020. Um, we're interviewing Dr. Sandy Shullman as a psychologist leader within Ohio, and she served in the past as president of the Ohio Psychological Association. So she's been a leader for a long time in Ohio and also at the national level. She's a fellow of 12 divisions of APA. And has served on the board of directors in APA and is now president. So we're having this interview on July 13th, 2020. So just to set the context for today, APA was already in a time of transition. We had just hired a few years ago a new CEO, Dr. Arthur Evans, and had developed a new strategic plan that was ready to launch this year. Then in March, a few days after the end of the Practice Leadership Conference, which was previously called the State Leadership Conference, all of us were in DC together, ready to go to Capitol Hill to do advocacy, and COVID-19, the coronavirus pandemic hit. A few days later, it was declared a pandemic by the WHO and surged up in July now, and there was a surge in April as well before we started to get it under control. As folks shifted to control the pandemic, we went into an economic recession. A lot of people have died from the disease. It was coming out of China, so there was an increase in xenophobia and fear of Asian folks. And as psychologists, many of us, almost all of us, shifted to delivering telepsychology and working remotely from home, many of us. Finally, about a month ago now, the very end of May, there was the killing of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis. It was an African-American man killed by a white police officer who knelt on his neck for 8 minutes. This awakened protesters across the country and across the globe. It seemed to be an awakening for a number of white folks to become better allies, to become anti-racist, and the movement for Black Lives has become possibly the largest movement in the history of the world in terms of protests. So all of this has been happening in your presidency while you're in charge of the field of psychology and the APA. As we think about, before the pandemic hit and before the death of George Floyd, I'm wondering how you were thinking about your APA presidency at that time.
I do vaguely remember what I was thinking at that time. No, I came into the APA presidency with hoping to create a different perspective about the APA presidency. And now circumstances have probably made that much easier for people to understand. I came in originally, I don't know, maybe the 128th president, 120, I forget which one I am, but the idea behind it was that it wasn't my presidency, that it was the APA's presidency. And because APA was in transformation, rather than putting the primary emphasis on my individual projects or initiatives, that I felt the best and highest use of myself in the presidency was to help the transformation of APA to an organization that was much more externally focused with greater impact for the public good, for enhancing the discipline of psychology and the profession of psychology. So that's where I started. I really did start from a perspective that I wanted to do the presidency a bit differently than my more recent predecessors that I could see up close and personal. So the circumstances at this point made it very easy. So my expectations about doing it the way it was always done were different to start off with. So, and they indeed were fulfilled, but not necessarily by my actions as much as the context changing completely within a matter of, what, as you said, about 10 weeks of being APA president.
Yeah, so I like that idea of wanting APA to have more of an external focus, and definitely external events have taken the forefront of the year for everyone. So interesting. It was announced as a pandemic by the WHO 2 days after Practice Leadership Conference ended. And so since then, you've been helping to lead response to the pandemic. What in your leadership approaches have you found to be most helpful?
Well, what I can tell you is on Tuesday, March 10th, as we were sitting at the Practice Leadership Conference, Capitol Hill was just coming to some understanding of that COVID was going to come to a theater near us very soon. And so that day, everybody was on the Monday afternoon of the 9th, people had already scheduled their congressional visits. By Tuesday, March 10th, some of them were still very much in person. Some of them were starting to be phone calls. And Capitol Hill was kind of in emerging chaos, trying to figure out what it was going to do. And we had our conference of 300 plus people trying to figure out what we were going to do. Hence, that Tuesday, March 10th at the hotel was the first mini command central we had about trying to figure out what we were going to do at first and foremost for the safety and effectiveness of the members that we had on site that were lobbying in Capitol Hill on behalf of psychology. So that was the first challenge. Then by March 10th, which is a Thursday, APA, we made a decision. CEO consulted me. We made a decision that we were going to do a remote test of how to do APA virtually, because we looked at the handwriting on the wall and said, this is probably not sustainable the way things are going now. So that Thursday, which is only 2 days after the Practice Leadership Conference, APA went home, did its virtual day, and then we made a decision that following Monday to stay virtual. And then by Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday of the following week, the mandate happened. So we actually were ahead of the curve. So the first big challenges in leadership was how to make that transfer of the organization virtual for the safety of employees, to think then about how we were going to engage members and keep them safe and keep them engaged with the activities that we were doing. And then, of course, we're responding at the same time to the public needs, because COVID is going wild. Public policy is being formed or not formed on the spot, as the case turned out. And so things were very, very chaotic in that. So trying to establish some priorities based on our values of safety first, and then the values that we've embedded in our strategic plan about, inclusion and diversity and equity and fairness and all of those other things. But safety first was the primary base for the first pieces of that. Once we did that, I think what would be fair to say is that we had a strategic plan that our council had passed in the August prior. And it had 4 major strategic goals with a lot of objectives that went with it as well. And actually what happened is, the way we looked at it was that our 4 major pillars of our strategic plan, which are to enhance our impact in trying to deal with critical social issues, to help the public get a better understanding of the full range of what psychology could do, to prepare the discipline and profession of psychology for the future, and to become a voice that had greater impact when psychology spoke. We realized that the strategy was right for the emerging context, but that we had to do it in a completely different context. And so I think one of the things that was very fortunate from my perspective is I was already in the mode of we needed to transform the organization to align with our strategic plan. The environment threw us completely off of how we operated traditionally. So we had both the chaos and the problems of being out of sorts that every organization did, but we also had the opportunity to say, now's an opportunity to use our strategic plan to keep us moving forward toward the future and to try to help as much as we can in the present. So that's really what it's been about. And so once we started from that perspective, and once we assured the safety of the staff, and once we began to figure out we needed to communicate with the members and the public, the things that were done then, the decisions that we made then, which were important, is we installed a group of town halls and communications. I made it very clear that, and this is something I'd always wanted to do, but we didn't have the same need for it. I said, once a week, there should be a way that people know they can access key people at APA, whether they need to or not. Or at least we should be reaching out to key leaders periodically. We should be making these things regular. And if you'll notice, we have been doing that. We had established public town halls for information. We've established town halls with state leaders, division leaders, boards and committees, etc. And by putting those in place as other things emerged, like as the Black Lives Matter movement emerged out of George Floyd's death and some of the other issues that were going on, we actually already had a context for communication. The topics changed, the audiences changed. We had as many as 12,000 people that wanted to be on our town halls for Black Lives Matter. So that's a major piece that I think happened, and it happened because of the strategy of our strategic plan, which said we need to be communicating with our members more regularly. We need to be communicating with the public more regularly. So those town halls became one way of doing that. The other piece, of course, is what the staff did immediately. And we talked about, based on the strategic plan, we got the staff basically focused on, one, generating incredible information around COVID first, and our divisions and our experts in our membership at APA all contributed incredible things. And then the second thing was to work on the public policy piece. So our teams that did go virtually to the Hill were very instrumental in our priorities, which if psychology was going to be very integrally involved in the COVID crisis, we had big impact on the telehealth policies that the government put in. We had, in terms of immediate access and fee structures and things like that, we worked on those things immediately because the public was needing services they couldn't get in any other way. So those were the immediate pieces of things that that we worked on very strongly, was mobilizing people, mobilizing resources, communicating, and listening a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like you were able to pivot really quickly. Pivot, we've joked that pivot is the word of the year, to take care of the staff first, the APA staff, and then to mobilize everything toward providing resources and information, and then impacting public policy. And it sounds like something that also came out of that was what you were wanting to do ahead of time as part of the strategic plan, was enhance communication between APA leaders and members through that town hall kind of forum. I was really moved before that first forum came out after the death of George Floyd. You had made a bold statement as president saying that in the US we also now have a racial pandemic. And I saw that there were at least 10,000, sounds like 12,000 registered for this 1,000 room town hall that you could have. And these ended up really just being listening sessions where the leadership was listening to any of the 1,000 people in the room who wanted to speak. I was able to listen in on one of those. What did you learn from those sessions? What were some of the things that came out for you as a leader, listening to psychologists who were impacted by the racial pandemic?
Well, first and foremost, thanks for reminding me about our public policy statements that came out. Our public policy statements, one of the commitments that we were working toward this year and that I really wanted was that they had to be timely as well as clear. And that statement, of course, did get a lot of national attention by the phrasing we used, and got both criticism and support, and as possibly a good public policy statement should in the United States. what I learned through listening to these town halls, well, first of all, you hear the incredible stress, pain, uh, that people are going through, because here are our psychologists who are trying to help other people in the various contexts in which psychologists work, trying also to organize themselves, their families, their colleagues, their friends, and then try to be help as frontline people in some cases, or help other frontline people in other cases, to try to respond first to COVID, and then to the racial pandemic, and of course, let us not forget the disruption of the economy at the same point in this. So income issues were also critical all the way around. Um, what I also learned from this is that you watched. I could hear my colleagues. I could hear their frustration. I could hear their anger, and it, to me, it felt like the anger is directed in so many different places and so many different ways. And it would often come out in the town hall because we were there listening. The government's not listening, really, from my perspective, at this point in time. And maybe historically that will look different. But at this point in time, the government was not listening. And so this was one place where people could really express themselves in their frustration, as well as asking really pointed questions about how best psychology and APA could have an impact on public policy. So we got suggestions from people. People suggested names. People suggested approaches. And people also wanted to make sure that we had taken a tone that was reflective of APA's values. I think some of the things that were discussed in the town hall were how we were going to help the public, and also how we were going to look at our own house in terms of institutional and structural racism issues, which we're still trying to figure out the best ways to do that as we're going along. So the issues were so big all at once, and COVID was still there when Black Lives Matter emerged. They intertwined. You could see the increasing disparate impact on communities of color. So we came out then with kind of a mini plan based on what we heard as we were going along. One obvious part of that in the shorter term was to get our best evidence and our best experts together to create strategies that we could offer for some of the work that they are doing to restructure policing in the United States. We wanted to be a big part of that. We also wanted to be an ongoing part of efforts to eradicate institutional and structural racism writ large. We are working, again, with identifying experts and issues. The other thing that we did, that we were working on now that should come out for council, is a comprehensive COVID policy response, which means a statement on the places where psychology can make the most impact on COVID. And I'm assuming that we probably will have something parallel come out in terms of, and related in terms of racism specifically, but that COVID statement has an incredible amount of information in there about disparate impact and things like that. So that gave us, I think, a better idea of the range of issues that people were facing. And then I think the town halls also gave us clues to specific ways we could respond to members. Students were in much different need of things than our ongoing daily practitioners versus our scientists with research grants versus our applied psychologists that were trying to work with employer organizations. They all had kind of different needs, and we were able to more clearly hear them in there. And I think the underlying part, though, is just hearing the pain and the anger and the frustration, particularly in places where things were so either unnecessary or unfair or just mean, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. Ooh, those were really impactful town halls, and I'm guessing that it took a lot of energy to be on those town halls every night, different town halls each week, and plus doing all the work every day. Um, One of the things I think that's been really challenging for a lot of people at this time is managing our personal lives or having a personal life with all that entails, trying to keep our partnership vibrant, trying to manage our health concerns, get rest, manage our own fears of COVID or cautions we're taking to try not to get COVID, plus our work. Um, what's been helpful for you as a leader this year with these immense challenges in your leadership? How have you been able to manage to keep your own energy going and stay up for all of these challenges?
Well, I would add to the mix is since the beginning of April, I will have had 3 surgeries during this COVID piece. Uh, Details of which I won't for archival purposes go into. But they were, and everything's working out. I'm about to have my last surgery to kind of get everything back in place. So that was not a small issue. Actually, one of the things that helped to some extent for me personally, because I had some of these physical challenges, is that because we were all virtual, my goal was not to get back to an energy level and an opportunity where you had to travel everywhere to do everything. I think, ironically, I could recover faster for the purposes of being the APA president in a virtual environment than I could in an environment we would have had in the past. For me, there are a couple things. I just wrote a Monitor article that includes some of this. I'm drafting that for whatever month it comes out. There are a couple of things that really helped with my energy. I mean, besides important things like my life partner and my colleagues and friends, et cetera, support, that kind of support. But there are 2 other pieces that I think were really important for me. One is keeping the purpose in mind of what I was trying to do. When I got up in the morning and I'm APA president, what's my purpose? And because we had done a strategic plan and because we were kind of clear where we wanted psychology to kind of go to up its impact, et cetera, every day I just tried to focus on those things that would help enhance our impact in some of those ways. And so that purpose was very, very clear. And the second thing is a bunch of reframing. Because even though I had started with a little different frame on the presidency, I kind of had to reframe it again as to what the role of the president would be. So there were many things that a president typically does that, that certainly all the things that involve travel reframed. And by reframing it, we actually came out with things that actually worked better in some cases. Now, obviously, that's not true for everything. But for example, one of the roles of the APA president is to represent APA internationally. Now, reframing that as how do I enhance international relations at a time of COVID? Well, because of COVID and because of all of our institutional structural racism across the globe, well, we had a group of international leaders that started meeting, and we're now up to about 60 international psychological associations, a subset of which meet twice a week. And we talk about common issues. We bring experts from different countries in to share research and strategies for how we deal with racism, violence in the home, COVID, dealing with first responders, etc. And so the contacts and the relationships I've built as from the international part of the role, reframing that role, we've actually had more international contact this year than probably at any time prior, because people are willing to get on and be involved in dialogue as a group twice a week for the benefit of the world with psychology. So reframing that, for everything that didn't happen the way I expected, there's a different challenge that we can do at this point. And rather than just looking at the future of psychology in general, reframing it as what the future is going to look like post-COVID or COVID created ongoing. So I think that's part of what keeps me going is, friends and family, framing and purpose. And I think that's, and as long as I have those, that kind of helps me stay there.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's exciting to hear about the international collaboration. I know you've traveled and consulted internationally, so that's definitely in your background. What are some of the things you've learned, or what have been some of the common issues where that international group of psychology associations has benefited most from talking together?
Well, we've collectively probably benefited most by seeing the range of approaches and what were the culturally contextual issues versus things that are truly global. So we were able, for example, to come up with a global statement on home violence, even though the cultural context for violence, child abuse, trafficking in many countries and cultures is very different. We could come up with common themes. The other piece that I think for me personally that comes out of this is, and I think some of my other international colleagues would say the same thing, is seeing the range of mindsets and frames about psychology. For example, in the US, we have such an individualistic frame on how we address psychology, how we address the population. Many other countries use a more collective approach, more communal approaches. And when you put the full range of approaches together from individual through communal strategies, you see that most all of us are missing a piece of the spectrum or overemphasizing one to the loss of others. And I've become even more greatly convinced as we've gone through this year through my international colleagues and also from other sources that psychology and APA really needs to take a public health perspective on mental health, so that we are not just focused on one part of the spectrum of mental health, which are people with diagnoses, and also almost exclusively one set of strategies for rectifying things, which is individual. That there's a full range of needs in mental health. Not everything has a diagnosis across the population and across communities. And we certainly can do things that are individual, but also group and community based as well. And we've really, I think, been too narrow about that. And so my whole perspective on, I think, what psychology should be about, for example, in the US, is very different than it was 6 months ago.
Wow, interesting change and learning from that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Ah, I'm interested in, we're kind of talking about different levels of system. You know, you're mentioning how clinical and counseling psychology tend to focus on that individual, and a lot of research does. And then your area of intervention has often been at the organizational level, and now we're talking about populations and the public level as a community. Um, One of the other pieces that occurred in the last month at APA had to do with that organization level and the staffing. And I understand that the transition to a reduction in force was partly in the works for a while and strategic and planned out and really important for our fiscal health as an association. I also know it came as a surprise to some folks to see that 50 open positions were cut and 50 filled positions were cut pretty suddenly. Some APA staff who'd been working for over 20 years had to leave suddenly. I know a lot of folks were upset and expressed concern, and that you did listening sessions after that too. One of the things I'm wondering is, you know, how do you handle complaints as a leader and upset? Because I know you can't always share all the information that would explain decisions or direction. But how do you manage when people are complaining a lot and you're working really hard and doing your best, but there's only so much you can do?
Well, the first thing you have to do is recognize that that comes with the job. Leaders, if you are a leader that needs to have everybody like you all the time, you're going to have a very, very tough time. I think, first of all, in terms of those organizational changes, I think what people forget, and which is sometimes personally hard, is recognizing that we can feel the pain of some of the consequences of those actions, just like everybody else does, that these do not get taken, these steps do not get taken capriciously, without thought, or without looking at the basic values that we have. In that particular situation, for example, first of all, that was in the works over time. Did it get accelerated by COVID? A bit. We actually moved some things to make sure we coincided with COVID, because there were more benefits for people that were laid off in the COVID situation than if we'd waited 6 months. So, or we think, we don't know. See, that's part of the issue. But one of the things that we've been talking about in the transformation all along are kind of a three-part model. First of all, the content. What are we going to be focusing on? What are we going to do at APA? What are we focusing on for psychology and the public? And what are we not going to focus on as much, because you need to have a focus and a strategy? Well, the strategic plan helped us with that. Second, and this is where, so the second piece is our capacity. And people think about capacity as how many staff you have, but actually what capacity is about is, do you have the right resources, and are you working in ways that leverage your impact? And so the plan for APA of the future is to work differently. Historically, APA has been an extraordinarily siloed organization. There are directorates. You know, as a member of a state psych association, you know a lot about the practice directorate. But if you have no other contact through any other part of APA, because you don't do anything else in APA, you wouldn't even know about the other directorates. And so the goal in the transformation is to bring one APA to all parts of APA's constituencies. And so part of what that reduction in force was about was, people think it's just looking at people, but it's looking at people and looking at positions, how to organize work to bring more different perspectives and expertise to any one program, initiative, or population that we're trying to serve. And so that was really part of the issue. So the other part of that issue, of course, was that due to some funding for innovative projects, particularly in our publishing area a number of years ago, we could see in the last 2 or 3 years a major structural deficit brewing, where even though we were balancing our operating budgets on a yearly basis, we had all this innovative money that was running out. And if we were going to keep these innovations going, we had to incorporate them in our regular ongoing budget. So I inherited, and I knew when I walked in on January 1st, before that, because we made some motions in December to try to deal with this, I knew on January 1st, as my first day of APA president, that I had a $19 million deficit in an ongoing way that had to be balanced at the APA. And if you recognize that, you recognize you can't take $19 million out of our budget without affecting some of the human resource pieces to start with. And how we work together was going to be critical. So it was both necessity and the opportunity to try to reformat how APA was going to work together that drove all that. Now, we're sitting looking at it on the inside. We did all of the things that you would hope we would do to pay attention to equity, diversity, and inclusion. We did all those things. But if you are from the outside of that, and as a member, and there was a staff member that you dearly loved, and that's how you associated working, as I work with this person, it's a very hard experience to understand. If you've not done a lot of organizational work and understand what information we can share and can't share, it's very frustrating if you're on the outside. So one of the pieces of leadership I think that I need to recognize is that we need to listen, we need to respond as honestly and directly as we can, and recognize that for some people and for some time, there's nothing that you're going to be able to say that's going to make people feel good. Somehow people expect that APA will be exempt from all of the other things that their home institutions are doing. And that part's really hard. And it's, on the one hand, it's good they have really high expectations of us. On the other hand, there has to be a reality that we, like other organizations, have to figure out how to sustain, because this was not a 1 year balance of budget thing. This is how will we have a sustainable staffing and budget that's aligned with our strategic plan going forward for the future. So it was a big piece of transformation, and it was going to come no matter what. COVID just made it all the more difficult, and I recognize that. So, and it is painful. I mean, nobody, that's like your worst job, right? That's the worst thing. Nobody wants to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. The different challenges you've had to cope with are the two big external ones with COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement, and then the big internal transformation. And on all of those fronts, you had members with a lot to say, I imagine, and wanting APA to do more and do more and do more.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's totally understandable. And we sometimes have to make some hard choices. And then again, try to keep lines of communication open so that people can clearly have the opportunity to express their concerns, get as much information as they can. And we're still in that process today. And it really is amazing how rapidly inaccurate information moves around organizations. And it intellectually when you're in the middle of it. It's sometimes it sometimes is personally challenging. You just have to remember that most of these concerns, first of all, are legitimate, well-intended. They're trying to do their best for us as well. And you can't always attend to all of them in a way that satisfies people. And that, I think that's it's hard to know. It's not always personal either. I mean, you're APA, Sandy, you're the president of APA. Not every one of those is about me. It's not really about me. It's really about the role and the representation of the organization. And that's what you have to keep focused on. And sometimes that's hard because people will say things sometimes that can be pretty painful.
Yeah. Great. As you've been coping with this and getting through, is there any kind of mantra or saying or wisdom or quote that's kind of been salient for you or helped you?
Well, yeah, it's not a very inspiring one, but one of the ones that I've often said is that we live another day. It's interesting. You need a long-term perspective when you're in a crisis and you're doing crisis leadership, which we have been doing much of this year. You need a longer-term perspective. And so having a strategy and having a focus on where we're trying to go really is that anchoring for your purpose and for reframing my role and everything I've said thus far. And at the same time, you have to stay in the moment and try to be in the moment. And when that moment passes on that day, that's my way of saying at the end of the day, yes, it might have been tough, or there might be this or that, but we've gone through another day. We're going to try to do better and make it work tomorrow. And that's really what that's really about, is that you can only do so much even when you want to. And tomorrow is another day and another opportunity to do that. And that's kind of what keeps me going.
Yeah, that seems really relevant for people, treating COVID patients right now in emergency rooms. And it seems really relevant for activists who are marching for our lives, as your t-shirt says, and trying to manage their energy and sustain. And each day we can only do so much. Yeah.
There's a lot of humility that goes in trying to be a leader in the middle of a crisis. If you thought you had great ideas about things, you've got to let go of that and deal with what is in front of you, even while you're looking at that longer term vision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ooh, some concern now is occurring. The Black Lives Matter resurgence started maybe a month, 6 weeks ago. And, some people are concerned that it's starting to wane or the energy or momentum is waning. How do you see psychologists and APA continuing to work toward change within systems in terms of that structural racism that we know is here?
Well, I see a version of about every approach to everything. I don't think, certainly within psychology and within APA, our energy has not waned about this. I do worry where the public will go, because we seem our attention span, because there are so many different things happening and so much 24/7 media. I won't just call it news, just media. Does unfortunately distract people with various things. But within psychology and within APA in particular, I see a full range of responses. I think a number of groups are still at the level of responding, just responding. They're angry, they're individually angry, they want something done immediately, they're frustrated, they don't know where else to get any action, and in their profession or in their discipline, that's the place to go. And I see a variety of divisions, for example, doing some self-examination, initiating projects in communities, doing some special publications, some of them are trying to review some of their policies and practices. They're looking at their representational governance, how their governance is going. They're doing a variety of things like that. At the APA level, and what's hard is there's the initial reaction, and we have town halls and expressions. What's actually going on at APA right now is we're trying to put some of the things that we heard into action, but that is not as visible when you are trying either to put together charges for task forces, identify experts and talk with them and see if you can get them engaged. Some of those things, we're continuing to do that. And I've also convened a group. I'm convening two groups. One group is meeting maybe the end of this week sometime. Both the staff and governance leaders to sit down and talk about how are we systematically going to address institutional and structural racism within our own house. Because people are writing letters and saying, well, this award is racist or this process is racist. If we deal with this incident by incident, we're really not going to get anywhere. So we really need to think about how do we want to set up, and I don't even have a name for it yet, structures, processes, approaches that will systematically help us address racism in our own house for the purpose of eliminating it going forward. I don't think just sitting back and studying it is the goal. The goal is to eliminate, to see what it is, see where we are, and see what we need to change going forward. So that's one piece for one group. The second group that I'm convening this week, or in the near future, is a group to continue to work on what has been known as the apology. We started an apology process, I believe, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, about how psychology and the APA basically apologize to our communities of color for contributions that psychology made intentionally or unintentionally that established institutional or structural racist practices. So we're working on that. There was an apology process over the last 4 or 5 years that was specifically focused on Native and Indigenous peoples. And I'd like to see that move. It kind of just kept moving along from president to president and didn't seem to be moving. So I'm going to try my best with this group to make some progress on what we're going to do with that. So, and what we would do with subsequent other communities beyond Native and Indigenous peoples. So,
Great.
Those are a whole range of things that we're trying to do at this point.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I'm interested that you came in wanting to be able to focus on external pieces and have an external view, but it's never okay to be telling other people how racist they are when you might have racist practices in your own house. So it feels like a lot of what you're doing too is always doing both, making sure that APA is able to speak with integrity about these issues.
Well, I see the institutional and structural racism as part of our transformation process. And if we do that well, we're going to be even more impactful in the external world. Not to bog us down on internal reflection, but to learn from our internal reflection so that we are also better able to help others. That's really the goal.
Yeah, that makes sense. Ooh. What do you feel has been most challenging so far this year?
Oh, everything.
Yeah.
I know that just a bandwidth. There's 24 hours in the day. There are so many people that you want to communicate with. There's so many things you want to get done. There's all the things that the staff needs, that our members need, that the public needs. You know, um, what's so frustrating is the just you know, my personal human limitations and the limitations of everybody else I work with. And it's hard sometimes also for me. I think it's frustrating to watch so many people working so hard and not getting ability to get away, time away. I mean, watching our staff up close and personal, trying to manage their personal lives, their children, their families, and working harder than I've ever seen them work, for example, and people still saying, well, APA is not doing the da, 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 all of which could be true at the same time. So the frustration is I wish I could help my colleagues and friends a bit more to feel less anxious and less on edge. The stress in everybody is palpable. So the lack of time and resources and the level of stress and distress people are experiencing is really, it's hard to keep, it's hard to keep being in that and not by it.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I have been amazed at everything APA has accomplished since the pandemic hit, partly because I've seen other organizations sort of shut down or close or say, well, we're on hiatus. And APA has not taken any hiatus at all, but just continued to respond so much. Yeah. So I know we're about out of time, and I just wanted to see if there was any other piece of wisdom or leadership knowledge that you'd want to pass on to OPA members as part of this interview.
Yeah, well, yeah, there is one thing that that's really important that I'm starting this year that I want to continue. I think for people that are members of state and provincial territorial psych associations, we have an opportunity, and I've set up now regular meetings with SPTA leaders. We really need to synchronize and change the fundamental relationship between SPTAs and APA. I think through the pandemic, there were a couple things that I hope happened. I hope many SPTA members saw the impact that APA could have at the national level, whether it would be in terms of telehealth or fee structures or training to get ready for changes in practice, etc. That was important. Or working with students at universities to try to figure out how to either get them credit, get them somewhere safe, whatever. I think as part of our transformation, and this is again the context we're in now, it just adds to that, is really trying to work more closely with the SPPAs from the APA side of the house to offer more of the rest of APA to SPTAs, and vice versa, to position SPTAs to really act across representing the full range of psychology. Because when psychology represents the best of our science, our applied psychologists, and our health psychologists, when we do all of that together, focusing on the same populations or organizations or whatever, we are way more impactful than just one slice of psychology or one slice of psychologists. So my advice for our SPPA members is this is a great opportunity to redefine who we are, how we help the public, how we promote psychology, and how we help support psychologists. And I'm looking forward to continuing these town halls we set up with these leadership groups. I plan to try to institutionalize, so even if we go back to in-person meetings, that we continue to have these kind of meetings throughout the year so that we can strengthen that relationship with SPTA.
That sounds great. That sounds great. Ah, it's been such a pleasure to have this hour with you, Sandy.
Well, like I said, if you talk to me in 6 months, there might be a whole other hour of material that's totally, well, some of it won't change. The purpose and the reframing and what keeps me going, I'm going to be very surprised if that changes a whole lot. But the context could change again, and that's just part of what you have to live with to do this. So it was enjoyable for me. I've done an oral history before, and that seems so steady state and static compared with what we're doing now. But at the time, it didn't, and so I think that's, you have to put it in the context of the time. So I'm glad to have a second opportunity to reflect on being in psychology.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
And my pleasure. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.